And today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for this Story Culture Live event. It is a beautiful confirmation that our speaker today, Dr. Clarissa Walker, will talk to us about the comfort, agency, and safety of story spaces in home places. She and I met as neighbors in Narragansett, where we lived in adjoining condominiums with her condo right above my own. And during the first quarantine, to maintain social distance, we shared stories many afternoons through the patio floor. As you will hear today, the power of story culture is not only an academic pursuit for Dr. Walker, but it is a life message with threads that run through her childhood, her professionalization process, and her current scholarship. She has presented the burgeoning elements of story culture live in story spaces of Duke University, the University of Rhode Island, in the 2021 International Writing Center Association Conference. Dr. Walker, a graduate of Emory University, anchored her URI doctoral work in composition studies and critical race theory. She currently serves as the interim writing director of Rhode Island College. And without further delay, I present to you Dr. Clarissa Walker in Story Culture Live.
Thank you, Nicole. Is my sound okay? Yes, okay.
You sound great.
Nicole. Thank you, Nicole DePaulo. That was very warm and very true. The stories that we shared during the quarantine got me through the quarantine. And thank you for that great introduction and for being a supportive friend and an activist yourself in the Rhode Island nonprofit landscape. So I do appreciate you being here. Thank you to everyone who showed up, who came to share in this scholarship and to share in this burgeoning project called Story Culture Live. I can't wait. I think my favorite part of the thing I anticipate the most is the Q&A to get feedback and so I can learn from you. I want to continue the thank yous really quickly to the VP of College Advancement and Executive Director of Rick Foundation, Kim Conway-Dumpson. I want to thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share, as Nicole very correctly said, burgeoning scholarship. It has to be born and get an opportunity to see light of day. And this is my fourth time presenting on Story Culture Live, and I'm really excited about where it's headed. And also thank you to Kathy Bacon with the patience of a Secret Service agent. I asked her, she worked with the Secret Service, but thank you. She works for college events and conference services. I'm going to jump right in and go into the role of storytelling and story spaces in anti-racism work. So this is the order of the presentation. I tried my best to keep it succinct because, as I mentioned to you before, my favorite part is the Q&A when it is lush and robust and a really nice exchange. But we'll start with what is Story Culture Live in its current form, especially what is it today, right? And the significance of culture in this definition. Story number one, of course, I would organize it with stories to an extent, Phoebe's Porch Treasure, and then Phoebe's Porch Treasure with the application of the Story Culture Live framework. And then story number two, the demands of Black linguistic justice, which is very dynamic and interesting, a group with coming out of a committee with 4 C's, and you'll learn more about 4 C's very quickly. And then the demands for Black linguistic justice with the Story Culture Live framework as a lens for discussion, okay? So what is Story Culture Live? Story Culture Live is the title of a podcast that is currently in production. The content consists of interviews conducted by me and discussions about the beautiful, empowering taxonomy of storytelling and story spaces. And I want to invite you to, Nicole will put a link in the chat if she hasn't already. And I want to invite you to drop your email and your name and just fill out this Google form so that when we do have the podcast launch in coming weeks, we can continue this dialogue and you can continue to be a part of this Story Culture Live journey, which kind of began on Instagram Live during the quarantine, where the first 5 interviews took place. So I immensely enjoy the podcast platform because as meaning making and a chronicling story space, I came to academia by way of print journalism. So it's kind of like one of my wheelhouses. So I love that exchange. The second function of Story Culture Live is the one that we will discuss in the brief presentation today. Story Culture Live is a critical race theory research framework that we will define and apply together. Its contribution is to provide a lens that will help us to better strategize actionable anti-racism work in our college classrooms. So you will see peppered throughout the slide presentation women, African-American women scholars and voices who've been an inspiration for this from the very beginning, one of which is Maya Angelou. And I know why the cage first sings, she says there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And that really sets me up for why culture. Another one that you will hear, and slide over the faces. I'm going to stick with this one for a second. So why culture? Like many composition studies educators, I lamented the assassination of a burgeoning storyteller in some of our composition students. Pressed by the writing and linguistic requirements and assignments of the academy, the story for many of our writing students was trapped in paralysis, a block. I believe that is what happens when the story begins with an emphasis on I believe that's what happens when the emphasis begins with a story, the emphasis begins on writing. So I asked myself, and this is how culture came into the picture, what would it look like if we allowed the story to begin with story culture? A moment ago, I promised you a framework with a taxonomy that looked at storytelling and story spaces for the purpose of strategizing actionable anti-racism work. And I'm going to make good on my promise. And this is another scholar and source of inspiration, mentor. I actually know Jacqueline Jones Royster. And I have come to recognize, however, when the subject matter is me and the voice is not mine, my sense of order and rightness is disrupted. So she is one of the inspirations for talking about voicelessness. So I promised a framework, and these are the components of the framework. Agency and positionality. Number 2, there's obviously 4 components. Kinship. 3, political and social tensions. And 4, unifying knowledge. Considerations of story culture conceptualized in this way. These framework parts could potentially, and I'll keep reminding you, are meant to be used to get us to actionable anti-racism work. No, actually, I lied earlier. This is my favorite part of this presentation. So as a kid, my love of storytelling was born on the front porch of my grandmother's first cousin, Phoebe. Graham and I lived in East Augusta, Georgia, which is still affectionately called the Bottom. But on many Saturdays, we took a taxi to the city. Cousin Phoebe lived in a shotgun house. This was a popular design in the South from the Civil War to the 1920s. The body of the house was narrow and long like the barrel of a shotgun. You could look into the front door, past the foyer, living room, 3 bedrooms, and the kitchen and have an unobstructed view to the back door. That's the floor plan of a shotgun house. We sat on Phoebe's compact porch, fanning ourselves with dated newspapers, greeting passersby, listening to Phoebe's stories, which she delivered from an iron porch chair that creaked when she leaned in or made arm gestures that claimed the air. 8th Street, where Phoebe lived, provided a sufficient cache of happenings, but because they were lush and theatrical, the stories of her own life were my favorites. Phoebe and her husband Ike owned a carpentry business, but they were also number runners. So I don't know if some of you might have a little thug in you, you might know what numbers runners are, but you might not. So I'm gonna leave it there though. But you can Google it after, or you can ask during the Q&A. But I'm gonna stop there with the Phoebe story, because I'm gonna move on to, although I'm remembering the late 1980s with you, I believe that Phoebe and her story space can help us today. So I want to talk to you about these 4 parts of the framework in the context of Phoebe, let's say as a case study for this framework. So agency and positionality of storytellers, as it is explained in Story Culture Live, is defined as the storyteller's perceived and or real relationship with power in the story space. Phoebe was an African-American woman, business owner with an 8th grade education. Her porch was situated geographically in the center of a racist Southern town. Yet in that story space, all days, she embodied agency. She was the power agent in the story space. Kinship. The kinship here refers to the kinship between storytellers and their constituents. 8th Street was a Black community lined with shotgun houses, peopled by Phoebe's familiar constituents. And I use the word constituent strategically because Phoebe won them with her story. They stopped in prepared to be updated or riveted. Kinship in this way is insulating. Linguistically, there was membership in stores of prior knowledge understood by all. So the third is political and social tensions. These are all considerations of the framework when determining story spaces and storytellers. When evaluating a lens to see them here. This registers the pressure of political and social tensions on the story space. This gives us a place to address lingering tensions born out of racist acts that hover over and impact such story spaces. That same 8th Street community was there during the 1970s Augusta race riots. The most devastating occurred when a Black youth, 16-year-old Charles Oatman, was brutally murdered in the Richmond County Jail. When the boy's body was released, he had several foot-long, 1/2-inch gashes in his back. The back of his skull was cracked. Lit cigarette butts had been put out on his body. And according to the coroner, the cause of death was drowning. Black Augusta, and of course, including this 8th Street community, rioted. A useful framework must register the political and social tensions that distend and weigh on storytellers like Phoebe and her constituents. And then number 4, a unifying knowledge, shared meaning-making components. Another source of inspiration, Toni Morrison. This was The Pieces I Am is the name of the documentary that was released the year of her passing. In the documentary about her life titled The Pieces I Am, Toni Morrison speaks of Black writers. She's talking about Black writers, storytellers who assume a white audience. And she says, I know that you are assuming a white audience because you're explaining things that you don't have to explain when you're talking to me. Similar to other Black storytellers like James Baldwin, Morrison said, I didn't want to speak for Black people. I wanted to speak to and to be among. It's us. First thing I had to do was to eliminate the white gaze. Simply, this part of Story Culture Live, the part of Story Culture Live amplifies the role of sovereignty. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about sovereignty that exists as she creates this porch treasure on this porch in this story space. Jack Hart states about storytelling, we learn something useful from characters who solve their own problems and who create their own destinies. An action line that displays the protagonist as a mere victim, someone buffeted by forces beyond his control, is an anti-plot. So I'm saying this sovereignty is not in response to an imagined white onlooker, but it's storying that makes meaning from among and from within. Storytellers and their constituents intersect in spaces of shared experiences. So now I'm going to move on, and I promised this in the beginning, the demands for linguistic justice. So to illustrate the pressures of political and social tensions in story spaces, I discussed the Augusta race riots of the 1970s. However, as we know, in the United States, there is a recursivity to violence against Black bodies. For the next story, I'm moving Story Culture Live out of the 8th Street community and into our higher education institutions, our classrooms. To contextualize, I offer this snapshot of the more recent accounts of the killing of Black people from 2014 to 2020. So these are the headlines, and again, it's for contextualization of the demands and the statement that we're about to talk about and do sort of the rhetorical analysis. So this was setting up July 17th, 2014, Eric Gardner was an unarmed African-American man killed by law enforcement in Staten Island. He's 56 years old. August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown, who was 18, in Ferguson, Missouri. This is believed to be the spark, or one of them, that launched Black Lives Matter. November 22nd, 2014, Tamir Rice, 12 years old, in Cleveland, Ohio. And there were 11 deaths total of unarmed African-Americans killed by law enforcement in 2015. But the one that received the most press was on April 12th, 2015, Freddie Gray, who was 25 in Baltimore, Maryland. And because the document that we're about to talk about was written and released in 2020, it's important for contextualization to talk about the March 13th death of Breonna Taylor, who was 26 in Louisville, Kentucky, and then the May 25th, 2020 death of George Floyd, who was 46, whose picture was shown in the previous slide in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So in July 2020, 6 composition studies scholars presented an 8-page demand statement to the 4 Cs. The 4 Cs is the Conference on College Composition and Communication. arguably one of the largest and most influential organizations in the composition field and in writing center work. These 6 scholars comprised the 2020, their formal name, it's there, 2024 C's Special Committee on Composing a 4C Statement on Anti-Black Racism and Black Linguistic Justice. The committee members are listed here. I think it's important so you can know where they're affiliated, who they are, and if you're in composition studies, you know these names. If you were in composition studies, you would know these names. And so here are the demands which had a reverberating effect in the field as they presented them. But I want to first say this. The official title of the demand statement is, "This ain't another statement. This is a demand for Black linguistic justice." And I want to read this quote before we read the demand. They wrote, "As language and literacy researchers and educators, we acknowledge that the same anti-Black violence towards Black people in the streets across the United States mirrors the anti-Black violence that is going down in these academic streets. Black scholars to the 4 C's ask these 3 salient questions. How has Black lives mattered in the context of language education? How has Black lives mattered in our research, scholarship, teaching, disciplinary discourses, graduate programs, professional organizations, and publications? How have our commitments and activism as a discipline contributed to the political freedom of Black people?" So these were the demands, and that is really the awesome, very awesome title that they chose for this. This ain't another statement. Number 1, we demand that teachers stop using academic language and standard English as an accepted communicative form, which reflects white mainstream English. Number 2, we demand that teachers stop teaching Black students to code switch. Instead, we must teach Black students about anti-Black linguistic racism and white linguistic supremacy. Number 3, we demand that political discussions and practice center Black language as teacher, researcher, activism for classrooms and communities. Number 4, we demand Black linguistic consciousness. Number 5, we demand that Black dispositions are centered in the research and teaching of Black language. And I want you to hear their voices on page 6. I'm going to read the 2 paragraphs, only 2 paragraphs of the 7-page document, but it's very quick, very short. If reading this made you feel some kind of way, instead of coming for these demands, let us help you redirect that energy. If you thought these demands were simply about teaching within traditional white norms or fixing Black students and their language practices, you got it wrong. This is a demand for you to do much better in your own self-work that must challenge the multiple institutional structures of anti-Black racism you have used to shape language politics. To all the upper-level college administrators, mid-level college managers, WPAs, deans, department chairs, superintendents, school district leaders, principals, school leaders, curriculum coordinators, state and national policymakers, and editors, we see y'all. Don't get it twisted. These demands are for y'all too. Because I'm from Georgia, I personally appreciate y'all. Don't get silent when it comes to Black lives and Black language in these academic streets. Keep that same energy when it comes to fighting for Black lives in our field that you had when you used the hashtag Black Lives Matter on your social media platforms following George Floyd's murder, chanted hashtag say her name for Breonna Taylor, and hashtag all Black Lives Matter for Tony McDade at your first hashtag Black Lives Matter protest this summer. Sent that email text to your Black friend to profess your allyship and help craft that Black Lives Matter statement on behalf of your institution or department. I wanted you to hear their voices, and I wanted you to hear what was submitted as a statement to this organization, and that is now part of the archive and structure and policy of the organization. Again, so what I hope to do in the same way that we did with Phoebe and Phoebe's Porch is have an opportunity to look at the four components with regard to this as a way of leaping into a conversation for our own campus and for our own classrooms and for our own story spaces, and initiating conversations about these demands. So these are the demands held up against what we've learned from the Porch treasure generated in the environment that Phoebe created, right? So the purpose here is to really get back to, if we've gotten away from it, or remain with it, learning from the elders and not reinventing the wheel, but using what we know of these community story spaces to extend upon what they're trying to do, or what the demands required or asked of us in 2020. So these were, holding them up side by side was an opportunity to isolate themes and ways of talking about what they were asking for in these five demands. Number one, we demand that teachers stop using academic language and standard English as an accepted communicative norm, which reflects white mainstream English. So one of the things that we learned with the environment that was created in the story space of Phoebe's Porch was the location of agency. Agency was always located with her in this story space. She was an agent of change, and it was a focus on horizontal relationships rather than vertical. And what I mean by that is there's not a need to discuss inferior, superior in the hierarchical conversations that happen in story spaces like this in the university. On her porch, there was more of a horizontal arrangement. And then Black linguistic choices were valued on the porch. But the emphasis here is the location of agency. Who has the agency? And we're going to talk more about that. And I will add to that, this is where that conversation about code switching often comes up in this presentation. Code switching versus code meshing. If you know these terms, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, it's okay. Code switching, code meshing is kind of like on a continuum where the end of it or the extreme of it would be this call for Black linguistic justice. But one question that comes up is, what about code switching? So where it says, which reflects white mainstream English, code switching is causing us to switch to something. Switching to what? Like when we're generating questions to reconfigure our classroom spaces and look at story culture and story spaces, switching to what and why? Switching to conform to what? And who makes the decision? Agency, right? Agency and power. Who makes the decision to what is considered valuable or appropriate? That is what they are talking about in this demand. Number two, we demand that teachers stop teaching Black students to code switch. Maybe it's in part two. Instead, we must teach Black students about anti-Black linguistic racism and white linguistic supremacy. And when we look in the space and we're generating questions and talking about what we can learn from our elders in Black communities and Black story spaces like Phoebe's Porch, we can learn from the Baldwins, the James Baldwin quote, and the Toni Morrison, who talks about removal of the white gaze for an audience, like not having the white gaze be in the audience. And I submit, as a part of Story Culture Live, especially removing the supremacy of the white gaze, right? And on that porch, in that story space, was an unmasking of oppression. There was no concern with making sure that we say the comfortable things. Everybody in the room needs to be comfortable with these very uncomfortable topics, right? So it's stripped down of its commitment to trying to keep impossibly topics that are impossibly very uncomfortable, comfortable, and acknowledgement of registering tensions in the story space. I mentioned the race riots of Augusta, Georgia, and of course, all of the deaths of unarmed Black African Americans. So having a space where that conversation doesn't have to be avoided. Number 3, we demanded political discussions and practice center Black language as teacher, researcher activism for classrooms and communities. Creating a distribution of agency that allows for the formation of many teachers in the space, in the story space, many storytellers in the story space, and for several stories was evident in the story space that we talked about in the beginning. And then cultivating communities of storytellers and constituents in the classroom, people who are won over by stories and people who are free to win using their prior knowledge, which is celebrated, right? Celebrated and shared. Number 4, we demand Black linguistic consciousness. So this honors the scholar's call to 4 C's to learn, to establish expertise. This is about the establishment of expertise, who gets to be the expert. That is informed by lived experiences as Black people and Black language speakers. That was exactly what I was saying. The people on either side of the living in the shotgun houses on either side had a shared experience. So as Toni Morrison said, I know when you're talking to me because there's certain things you don't have to explain, right? So that is the consciousness, where the consciousness could be applied. So number 5, and the final one is, we demand that Black dispositions are centered in the research and teaching the Black language. Inherent in the 8th Street community were the, quote, option to explore or connect with cultural knowledge and perspectives, right? So that's the knowledge of the space, the knowledge of the community, right? The collective knowledge of the community being valued and honored and lifted up. So I wanted to end with 2 quotes from from Jacqueline Jones Royster. One is talking about home places, which is what Nicole mentioned at the very beginning. And it says that home place is a cultural community that exists still quite significantly beyond the confines of a well-insulated community that we call the mainstream. And that between this world and the one that I call home, systems of insulation impede the vision and narrow the ability to recognize human potential and to understand human history, both microscopically and telescopically. This is also Royster. People in the neighborhood where I grew up would say, "Where's your home training?" Embedded in the question is the idea that when you visit other people's home places, especially when you have not been invited, you simply cannot go tramping around the house like you own the place, no matter how smart you are. This is meant to be the beginning of an important conversation. Hopefully, stirring questions caused you to, as they said in this demands letter, feel some kind of way about coming up with actionable anti-racism strategies for our classrooms and institution story spaces. It's my hope that we as African-American scholars also can continue to draw from the elders, but not only the elders of academia, but the elders who established their agency on porches of shotgun houses, like the ones in Georgia. Thank you. So what I would like to do is, I can't really see, but I can't see the chat either. Oh, yes, I can. I can see the chat. So if you could drop a question in the chat, or we're going to switch to the Q&A. I wanted to be sure that we had time for Q&A and got people out in time for the next thing. So we can just start, we can just jump into it. There's no formality needed. Jump into the Q&A. Does anybody have a question? Want to raise your hand? And I'm looking. You know what? I can't see hands. So if you could just. Okay, yes, someone's asking what is the Google form linking us to? So I said that in the beginning, I said that we are in production currently. Story Culture Live is also the name of a podcast that we'll be releasing soon. We're editing some interviews, and we are scheduling others. So when, yes, I do. I will end the screen share. I'm so glad Kathy's here because, I would mess this all up. So when we release the podcast, I will have a way of sending you notification or information about the podcast. So that's what the Google form is for. Okay, so the question from Elizabeth Silic. Elizabeth, I want you to, if you don't mind, can you clarify your question a little bit? Because I want to be sure that I'm addressing what you want me to address. How do you think the demands you covered have impacted the field? Okay, no, that's clear. Sorry. So it was, no, it was a couple of things. It was a very emotional moment. I said, when it was July 2020. So most of us were still in quarantine, right? It was the summer and it was a lot going on. So it was an emotional moment. And so what I believe, this is me, I'm not the spokesperson for anybody, but this is what I believe and I saw. I mentioned a continuum, and the continuum only exists because of time. In the beginning, I believe it was mostly for me, Lisa Del Pitt, that introduced me to code switching. That was the first, and that was early 90s or 90s. And then scholars like Vershawn Young started talking about code meshing. And then now we have Black linguistic justice, which is rattling all of the other. They're not, in my understanding, asking for the same thing at all. Code switching, which is, the way that I talk to Nicole through the floor, very casually, like girlfriends, is not how I presented in this presentation. And then code meshing would be kind of like how, I'm Southern, I'm from Georgia. So every now and then you hear some y'alls and some things coming out of me that's like, where's she from? So code meshing is a combination of dialects being used toward one presentation, right? And so there's still some adjustments that are believed to be made because you're trying to adapt to what is believed to be a hegemonically designed mainstream white English, or a dominant agent's configuration of what linguistics should be, right? And Black linguistic justice and an end to linguistic violence kind of said to hell with all of that. You know, how it comes out is how it comes out. Like, you know, so it was an emotional moment. And it wasn't like students were in classrooms dealing with imposter syndrome. We had that, you know, we had that for years. We had Black bodies being killed in the street when this was released, right? So it was a whole different, when you say how did it affect the field, it was a whole different kind of wave, you know. And so how can you say Black Lives Matter, but then go into the classroom and continue to oppress African American students and continue to not isolate this conversation and believe that it is important enough to have its own, which is very kind of controversial still, right, to have its own story space. And I can share that I am, okay, I'm stop reading because then I get distracted because I'm very interested in what's going on in the chat. I went to a diversity, I'm a part of a national diversity committee. And I'm brand new. We're starting the new, most of us are new members to this committee because it's rotating. And the last meeting was defining diversity. And that conversation is part of what this linguistic justice conversation is about. Because as soon as you say African American, unarmed African Americans, and you start to talk about Black linguistic justice and all of the issues around it and the challenges around linguistic violence, immediately someone offers, well, other groups have that same problem. It's not just Black people, right? So that becomes a story space too, the struggle bus. All the marginalized brown and Black people need to be on the same struggle bus, right? Not because they bought tickets, but because someone is assigning seats. So one of the things that they are very intentional, if you read the document over and over again, they're saying Black linguistic justice. It's not to say or to undermine or diminish the journey of other people and other groups. It's to say that things going on with people of color, Black people deserve its own story space, is what this presentation is about. It deserves its own conversation, own meaning-making spaces, right? So I ended early because I knew this would happen because I ramble, but that's a great question. Okay, thank you for speaking today. Yes, I get that a lot. I should talk more about Phoebe. I get that a lot. Yeah. Do people here know what numbers runners are? What a number runner is? I just wonder about that sometimes. Like, so I also think even if I say y'all instead of everyone, I'm not really sure I understand, Olivia. Is there a question or comment? Can you elaborate on your comment? Because you're talking about radical. You're talking about radical voices and the usefulness of this radical positionality, right? This relationship.
I can clarify. I think I'm just, when you say, because with the majority of the things that you were saying, I really resonate with because that's how I was raised as well. It's just like, I remember my great aunt sitting with her on the porch and she was so intelligent, but it's like her way of speaking, she was an old Southern woman, and like her word choices, she would say y'all, she wouldn't say you guys or everybody. She would be like, that's the way she would speak. And I think that people of color, specifically Black people in this day and age, are kind of falling back into that radical mindset of like, I'm not here to make you feel comfortable all the time. I'm not here to constantly police myself when I have a point to prove or I have something to say. I'm still smart. I'm still educated. Just because I say y'all don't mean that I'm not smart anymore. And I don't have to always filter myself to make people that don't look like me comfortable.
You're right. That's exactly what.
Amen.
No, yeah, no, that's exactly what the demands were saying, and that was really the heart of the presentation. And also, I'm the interim writing center director, so there's also this part where, and that's why I said, the paralysis, and there's a lot of research on this, right? The paralysis seems to occur when people start with the craft. They start with the writing and they don't start with the story, right? And so part of that is that feeling the restrictions and the constraints that you're talking about, right? And so that's why I asked the question, like, what would happen? Because I said I have a journalism background, and I always, we had a 3:00 deadline. Stories were due, and there was never writer's block. And it wasn't because you're an amazing writer, it's because it was just due. So how is it possible in that space for this to happen easily every day? Because papers come out every day. Papers came out every day. But in composition classrooms and writing centers everywhere, students are suffering with this paralysis. I ask these questions all the time, and there's no one answer. There's no simple answer, but I believe that you're right. And yeah, like who assigned, who gave that assignment? I have to deliver this in a way that makes you comfortable. Yeah. So that was the question before was really a good one too, talking about like what was the reverberating effect of this on the field, was because when it came out had everything to do with how it hit. Because we are talking about a completely different moment for African American experiences. So this presentation did wake me up a bit. Okay, when it comes to gun violence statistics. Yeah, he's looking at the statistics and the data, Phil is.
I just feel statistics are, if we went back to that point, you said about 100, when it said George Floyd, 100 and X people were killed. I just, but if, a simple Google test will also say, oh, well, 1,000 people have been killed. But when you put it in percentage of 1 in 3 people are killed a day from shootings, and one person is a Black person, then the other 2 are a wide variety. I think that's a very effective more for me. It just really points out the fact that, yeah, and Black people only take up 13% of the community. That's statistically, that's really high off the charts for me when I think about math in that form.
Sure.
I just think,
yeah, some people are moved by the anecdotal examples and some people are moved by the data. Yeah, but both are sickening, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Thank you very much for this. Yeah. It's very important.
Yes, of course. So thank you, Phil. So yes, the hypocrisy is illuminating environment. I'm trying to see comments, and Megan said she Googled something, but she didn't say what she Googled. Let me see. It's like illegal lotto, right? I'm not sure I understand that. Can you explain that? Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, right. Did you Google it? Yeah. Oh, so that's what it is. Okay. So that's what you meant. You Google numbers running. Yes, it's illegal lotto, basically illegal gambling. Very lucrative. Yes, it is underground gambling. Everybody's talking about the numbers running. Yes. Are there any other questions? Are there any questions? Does anybody want to speak and not necessarily, we're not stuck. We don't have to ask questions in the chat. You can ask, and there are no dumb questions. I'll answer as best I can. Or maybe someone else is here that can answer it. Are there any other questions? Oh, I'm supposed to say, okay, Marcus has his hand up. See, I'm not.
Yes, first. Yes. Hi, how you doing? I just wanted to say hello, Nicole, and wanted to say this was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. But I just wanted to make a comment about what Phil said, and it's really important for us to be like, so many people are so stuck on anecdotal, and they forget that there are so many different types of learners, and so many things resonate with different people. Yeah. So I just like implore people to integrate data, integrate testimonials, integrate visuals, do whatever you can do to try to bring in different audiences. So I just thought that was really cool, how Phil just brought to life something that I try to share often. So that was just cool to see that in real time. So that was nice.
Yes, that's why. Yeah, I appreciate your comment very much. That's why I didn't leave it with my favorite thing, which is for me the anecdote about, because the personal anecdote about my grandmother's first cousin Phoebe, right? But I also brought in the headlines that he was talking about because it does give context for what was happening when they dropped this statement. Because that made all the difference as far as like when it hit and how it hit the organization and the field. So you're absolutely right. People are moved by different ways of telling stories. That's why we're here. Yes, absolutely. Some people can't connect with data. They need humans and they need stories, and some people don't believe it unless there's data tethered to it. So you're absolutely right. Are there any other comments or questions? Thank you for that.
I'd love to ask a question. You were talking about in the framework, the political and social tensions and that being a part of storytelling. And I work a lot in the nonprofit sector and in advocacy and see all the time how people's stories are not seen as a legitimate way to communicate information about how policy is impacting their lives. And this intersection of academia and politics and non-government institutions and the people, like you said, like on the porch, it's this horizontal, positioning where everyone's voice is welcome and equal and beautiful, and where Black linguistic culture is celebrated. And when we think about going into these spaces, these vertical spaces, these hierarchical spaces, how stories are really just diminished and how like this is just put to the side. Do you have any hopes of, or thoughts about how story culture in academia will then translate into politics and kind of like into the social change work if we can really, just get people to open their minds and think about the way that words mean and the way that stories translate into action and, politics and all of that?
You're going to have to make that question more succinct, Nicole. 2 lines. What's your question for me? Because I feel like what you're asking me is, can it be done? And my first instinct is to say, yeah, it can be done. It can be done by you because that's your wheelhouse. That's where you are located, right? And that's why we're here having this conversation. So I want to be sure that I'm answering your question when I speak on it. So what are you asking me?
And not necessarily a particular question, just your thoughts on that topic. But I guess if you did want it in a more succinct question form is, do you have any hopes to apply story culture live in that way? Or are you planning to, focus on academia?
No, I have no desire to limit story culture live to academia. In fact, the interviews are a mix of people on purpose. And Gita just left, Gita Brown, and she's wonderful, and one of the things that we talk about is, we talk about story culture live, and then she's a journalist, a writer, a powerhouse, and she's like, you're getting too academic, and I like people who keep the guardrails up. You don't need to be too much of anything for things to be useful, for things to be, so things can be functional, because it really is about what we can learn from those story spaces. There was something very important happening there. And because of where it was, we could miss the lessons. And that's the point of this presentation. That's why I'm doing it here today, and I'm doing it in Norway next year, because we can miss it. We can miss it. And there are very powerful lessons to be to be learned. And I think that because you're already located in that space, you might be the one to begin the work that you're describing. Yes, Sarah. Sarah, you're muted. Sarah,
sorry, can you hear me?
I hear you now. Yep.
Oh, sorry. Good. Okay. I just wanted to first say thank you very much for the presentation today. It was great. I was the one that said the comment, I wish I could be on Miss Phoebe's porch and hear some of the stories, because that must have been fun. I always have placed a great value on my personal elders, and I always enjoy learning a lot from them, and I still do. But when you speak on, like linguistics and I've brought this up in this class, I know a lot of my classmates are here today. So they've probably already heard me say it, but something that always strikes me with different linguistics is, and particularly with Black people, is when, Barack Obama was in office, and people you would hear all the time say, oh, he speaks so well. He speaks so well. And you're like, well for what? Like, what are you trying to say? Mm-hmm. So that's just that just reminded me, because that crosses my mind all the time. It's been years and we all miss him, but I'll never forget the way that people used to speak about him. Yeah. And it was almost like, they were shocked at, the way he presented himself because he's Black. It was almost assumed that he wouldn't speak intelligently and conduct himself intelligently and informally. So
yeah, you're right. And, he comes up a lot as far as examples. When I give this talk, people like to talk about him as a code mesher. He's very, very good at that, and but that's the great thing about looking at agency and positionality. And positionality literally means your relationship with power, because it doesn't allow us to oversimplify this conversation about storytellers, because he is a man. And there's something about gender that has to be in this conversation too. He is received differently because he's a male storyteller, an African-American male storyteller versus an African-American woman storyteller, or however, you're all of the things that come together to form identity, which is why it's problematic to create a struggle bus and put all the marginalized groups in a conflating way. And make any assumptions about that journey, because there's a different, a dear friend of mine, I don't think she's in here, is the writing center director at Stanford, and she's an African-American woman from Georgia too. And we often talk about how different it is, this walk, this journey, this experience is for African-American men who are doing the work that we do. Right. So, it's really also part of the charge is to avoid oversimplification in any of these areas. Right. And really understand, or try to understand and reach for understanding of the positionality of the storyteller at work. That's why I so appreciated Phoebe, and her power, and how her power was established, and how much I learned about what was possible from what happened on that porch. There was a lot of, and like I said, I think that's why Ngita teases me all the time. That's why I'm tentative about telling stories, because it's tricky, because she was very open about the, all aspects of her journey, right? But yeah, Tracy has her hand up. Tracy has her hand up.
Hi, thank you again. Just to echo, I'm coming from the psychology department, and a handful of students here today are from our community psychology class. And what you're talking about is really pertinent to some of the topics that we're talking about over there. And I'm trying to figure out how it seems like this conversation, maybe because it was storytelling, was couched in sort of writing and literacy. Are you having these conversations in more sort of positivistic, scientific kind of areas of academia where it's clearly very much needed? Even when you're talking about like, how has Black Lives Matter impacted academia, not just in this one area, but like overall, it's such an important topic. Are those conversations going on?
Yeah, I think that they are. You picked up on the biased and the siloed nature of our disciplines, just like you just rep psychology, right? And that's what I was doing. I was repping my field, which is composition studies and writing center work, right? So that's what we do, but I'm hoping that with frameworks, because you and I can, although we are coming from different disciplines, and we have to admit, there are silos in how we do our work. But we can agree that actionable anti-racism work is needed. And there are frameworks and conversations and questions that we can both ask in respective areas. So what you heard was my bias in my professionalization process, which is what Nicole said when she introduced me. In the same way that your question just reflected, your department. Right. So, but absolutely in the other departments, these conversations are happening. They just didn't happen here because you have a writer and a director of a writing center and, and a Phoebe fan presenting to you. That's why it went the way it went today. Thank you for coming, Elizabeth. So I hope that you were able to use this link that Nicole has put in the chat, because we would love to have you join us to continue the conversation and to continue with the podcast when it is released. I have to run. So people are leaving and I think we're done. I'm not sure. Are we done, Kathy? If there's one more question, a burning question or comment, yes, we are done, she said. Okay, so I thank you guys for coming. Yes, and please stay in touch. Thank you for coming, Anna. Thank you, Phil. Thank you for your question. It's very important, data-driven work. So have a great, there's the link. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you.